You know what your TTRPG game needs? More Scottish monsters. There are a few which have been absorbed into what's broadly known as Western fantasy, but we've got loads more to share with you. I'm going to show you some creatures that you might not have heard of, from the very wee to the so big that its teeth are actually islands, and we're going to make some multi-system stat blocks for a couple of my favourites. My name's Rich, and this is Renegade Rolls. So Scottish cryptids are actually pretty well represented in TTRPGs. The D&D Monster Manual gives entries for redcaps, will-o'-the-wisps and unicorns, which are actually Scotland's national animal. We also have the Seelie Court and the Unseelie Court of the Fae. So, from smallest to largest, Renegade Rolls is proud to present the top 10 Scottish monsters that I can't believe we've been playing TTRPGs without. Here we go. We start with the tiniest wee thing you ever did see, or maybe not see. The Gigelorum, a creature so small it fits inside the ear of a mite. That's literally everything I could find out about it, even going back to some primary sources. The rest of the entries on this list have much more solid stories behind them, but the great thing about Folklore is that it gets invented all the time. We are game masters, we're experts at this. That feeling on the back of your neck when you just know there's something behind you. That's the Gigelorum warning you. When you stop yourself just before putting your hand on the hot stove. You really think that was you? The Gigelorum are a hive mind of tiny creatures who live all over your skin. They protect you in subtle ways and keep you safe, as if you die, well, where are they going to live? In TTRPG terms, that sounds a lot like the Lucky feat. Now imagine interacting with your luck while you sleep. We've got a fun narrative version of something that's usually quite abstract. I want to hear your Gigelorum headcanon in the comments. Maybe we'll start our own folklore. Next up, we have the Scottish wild haggis. Not to be confused with the vile or boggin stuff people eat at Burns Night, though seriously the veggie haggis is way better. Don't believe the naysayers who tell you that haggis aren't real. You can see one in Kelvin Grove Museum in Glasgow, on display with loads of other creatures. Haggis roam the wilderness and highlands of Scotland and are famous for having one leg longer than the other, so they can run around the sides of mountains. Haggis come in two distinct varieties, the clockwise and the anti-clockwise haggis. It's actually kind of tragic if you think about it. A wild haggis has never seen the face of one of its own kind. There's an entire ode to a haggis by Scotland's national poet Robert Burns, where he calls it the chieftain or the puddin race. But they are sadly underrepresented in TTRPGs, which is why I'll be fixing that. Next up, we have Cat-sith, where the Sith part translates from Gaelic as fairy. These are large black cats with patches of white fur on their chests that walk around on two legs when people aren't looking. There are some delightful tales about them, including one that says that they can steal the souls of the recently dead. If they can walk over a corpse before burial, then the soul doesn't belong to God, but is stolen by the Cat-sith. One nicer story is that if you leave out a saucer of milk on Samhain, the end of harvest and the start of winter, then the Cat-sith would be sure to bless your house. I for one would very much like to live in a house blessed by cat fairies. Likewise, you should bless your players with a Cat-sith companion. On one hand adorable, on the other much more than they seem. Now the implications for the Star Wars universe are fascinating as well. It becomes a very different story if the Sith are on the side of the fairies, giving in to your emotions and letting yourself experience the world to its fullest, rather than shutting yourself off, are philosophies I can very much imagine creatures like the Fae being in favour of. Bogle is a name given to all sorts of mischievous small humanoids, with the roots of the word being potentially linked to the word goblin. It's also the root word for bogeyman, although bogeymen and bogles are probably a bit of a different meaning. It's interesting to see that so many different cultures have similar creatures and seem to use them in similar ways. They're a bit different to redcaps, who are properly nasty, but instead bogles are generally a small person who's either wrinkled or ugly and will cause mischief using trickery and cunning to go after naughty children. They never seem to be deadly, more like infuriating, like gremlins, but without the cute and fluffy stage to begin with. To bring them to my table, I'd make them the ones who are blamed for all the things that go wrong in a village. Milk soured? Bogles. Babies crying? Definitely bogles. Whether these rumours turn out to be true or not, I'll leave as an exercise to you. The Glaistig, or Green Lady, is busy. She haunts at least 10 different castles in Scotland as well as many forests and uplands. Most versions of her tale speak of a beautiful woman wearing a long green dress, which hide her goat legs. She's potentially like a satyr, but ashamed of it. In some stories she's a protector of herds of animals, terrorising hunters if they shoot does rather than stags. Another story has her as a fey-touched noble who is killed, then her body gets stuffed up a chimney. She now haunts the castle but keeps on looking after the house. This is particularly bleak, even for folklore. Imagine getting murdered and still having to wash the dishes in the afterlife. Lots of stories about the Glaistig, or Green Lady, women in mythology in general, are dripping with misogyny. But if you're looking for some stories which are a bit more evolved, I can highly recommend the Uncaged series of adventures, full of modern stories of myths and legends where those who maybe traditionally have power get their comeuppance in some brutal ways. This isn't a sponsored segment, I just really like them. There's a link in the description. Folklore will always be wild and hard to pin down. So much of it has been shared verbally from one generation to the next, and a sighting of a big cat on the hills can morph over time to change and grow arms and legs and tentacles into something very different to the original story. When I asked the question on Mastodon as well as on YouTube, the vote between the two sites was pretty much a tie to decide which is the best Scottish monster, between Haggis and Nessie here. But there are also some fascinating comments. A user by the name of Malin gave me this wonderful additional example. I asked an older family member about old Scottish legends. She told me what she heard when she was younger from someone older still, and I suppose that puts the legend at least 100 years back. There are ghostly bagpipes that foretell death. There are banks of primroses where if you pick the wrong number, it acts as a code to open the hillside and reveal the fairy kingdom. If you enter, you rarely return. She stopped and said she's only ever heard this from one other person and doesn't know if it counts as real folklore, but I figure if it was passed down through two Scottish women across a century, then that's as authentic as folklore can be. On to the big beasties now, starting with some who are probably human-sized, but we've got some absolutely monstrous monsters coming up. We begin, as only befits her station, with Beira, Queen of Winter. Older and more powerful than all the other gods and goddesses who came after, she's said to be ancient and jealous of those with youth and beauty. Out of spite, she captured a beautiful young princess called Bride. We'll see again how very much on the nose some of these character names are. Beira had heard a prophecy that her son, Angus, the King of Summer, was foretold to marry Bride. Beira did not like this idea and did everything she could to make sure that the two of them could never meet and never marry. Angus set about defeating his mother. At one point in the story, during the darkest days of winter, Angus borrowed 3 days from August in order that his mother's reign would end prematurely. They fight bitterly, but Angus wins in the end, defeating Beira, at least for another year. Bride and Angus were married with help of the fairies. To weave this story into your games, I can imagine Beira and Angus as the anthropomorphic personifications of the series and beseeching the party to help their cause. Maybe they find their allegiances torn between the two. That whole story sounds so very much like Scottish weather to me, where we get every season in one day sometimes, and borrowing 3 days from August, making what should be the warmest days of the year feel bitterly cold, feels very, very Scottish to me. Likewise, those first spring days can feel like summer after Beira has given us a particularly harsh winter. The Big Grey Man is just so well named. It could have been the Man o' the Mists or something evocative, but nope, straight to the facts. We know what we're dealing with here. Legend has it that he lives on Ben Macdui in the Cairngorm Mountains, where he follows climbers who will hear the crunching of gravel behind them. People say he's 10 feet tall and fills anyone who sees him with dread. It sounds a lot like a Bigfoot or a Yeti or a hill giant if you'd like to run him as a monster, but I love this detail that when someone took off their hat when seeing the Big Grey Man, it did the same, which could mean that they were looking at their own shadow in the mist. The science behind this is even cooler than the story. We're looking at glories and Brocken spectres, which are the actual scientific names by the way, and they sound even cooler than Big Grey Man. For all you scientifically minded folks, this is a phenomenon of Rayleigh distribution and backscattering of the light from the sun. Kelpies live around all sorts of bodies of water and have a bit of a TTRPG pedigree. They appeared as seaweed creatures who could take on the shape of horses in the second edition of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, but have been sadly left out of subsequent monster manuals. We also have some enormous statues of them just near Falkirk. My favourite Kelpie story speaks of 10 children who are encouraged by a Kelpie to climb up upon its back. One boy hesitates and only puts his hand on its flank. He tries to remove his hand but he finds it's stuck and he has to cut off his finger in order to escape. Meanwhile, the 9 children who climbed on his back were taken off by the Kelpie and drowned. The story goes that that one boy only survived because he had a Bible in his pocket. There's a wonderful note by Gregorson Campbell calling it obviously a pious fraud to keep children from wandering on Sundays to play in lonely places and meddling with any horse they may find. It's Nessie, the Loch Ness Monster, one of Scotland's many gifts to the world, including whiskey, the bicycle, the telephone, a song to sing at New Year, its sign, not design, by the way, logarithms, electromagnetism, the television, Grand Theft Auto, and Iron Brew. Stories of Nessie go back to the year 565, with tales of a sea serpent and massive snakes in the water. The old tales of the Loch Ness Monster also get tangled up with legends of the Kelpies, with them only being distinct legendary creatures relatively recently. There have been lots of famous sightings of Nessie, one being the surgeon's photograph taken in 1934, which was discovered to be a hoax. Did you know that Nessie isn't the only monster in a loch? In Loch Morar, there lives another monster by the name of Morag. She's very similar to Nessie in lots of ways, but I suppose since they're both aquatic animals in separate lochs, they can't meet. This part isn't folklore, just me world building now, but maybe the reason it rains in Scotland so much is because Nessie and Morag are making it rain, so the levels of their lochs can rise and they can finally be together. Alright, it's the big one. Bigger than 100 Nessies, bigger than 1,000 Kelpies, bigger even than 1 billion Haggis. Haggai. Let's talk about the Stoor Worm. This tale is from the Orkney Islands, and despite its less than deadly sounding name, the Stoor Worm is probably a variation on Jormungand, the world-eating serpent of Norse mythology. This is a proper big boss monster, which would be a worthy end to any campaign. A lazy dreamer called Asipattle, which can be translated as Ashpaddle, dreams about being a hero one day. The evil Stoor Worm appears, and the kingdom is not even slightly prepared, as the worm wrecks places all over the coastline. The king is advised to feed it 7 virgins every Saturday to appease its wrath. When this, unsurprisingly, doesn't work, the king says that whoever slays the beast can have his magic sword, called Sicka Snapper, that he got from Odin, and the hand of, I kid you not here, Princess Jem de Lovely in marriage, most beautiful maiden in all the land, etc. 30-something brave, heroic heroes arrived and decided, nah, don't fancy this. Our boy Asipattle heard that the princess was going to be sacrificed next, and after stealing some hot peat from the cottage of an elderly woman, which if you ask me is going to be trouble later, he goes down to the shore, takes a boat and rows out to meet the beast. It's early in the morning and the worm gives a huge yawn as it wakes up. The boat is carried right inside its yawning mouth and into its stomach. Asipattle decides to try and light its liver on fire with the peat torch, causing the Stoor Worm to convulse madly as the boat is thrown from the worm's mouth and across the sea. The Stoor Worm dies in agony, with its body forming Iceland and the teeth forming the Orkney, Shetland and Faroe Islands. Asipattle's given the sword, marries Princess Jem de Lovely, and they live happily ever after, with the story finishing, and if not dead, they are still yet alive. We've got 10 monsters to play with now, which will hopefully feed your imagination and maybe haunt your nightmares, but I can do you one better. You can play with a couple of them at your table tonight, because I've been making lots and lots of Statblocks. I've been making Statblocks for you for D&D 5e, Dungeon Crawl Classics, Index Card RPG and Daggerheart. If you'd like to see them in another different system, do let me know, and I can probably make them fit. There's a link in the description for them, both in image and text formats, to do with what you will. First up, the tiny but mighty Haggis. Ugh, my attic, it's full of haggis. Can you brave adventurers get them out for me? Mechanically, I picture these little guys to be a super simple challenge, but with a nasty bite. If you're feeling mean, you could treat them like the Tribbles from Star Trek and have them rain down on the characters. Next, the Loch Ness Monster. Ugh, Nessie's been acting very strange, just sitting there with its head out of the water. Everyone's amazed, but it looks sad. Given that Nessie has never reportedly hurt anyone, I'm picturing it more as a gentle giant, but it would still defend itself if the foolhardy get too close. We as game masters and role players are creating folklore every time we get around a table with our friends. It's the stories we tell each other, and I bet all of you have shared a game tale with a friend at some point. Maybe your stories will get remembered and misremembered by your friends, and those stories will grow arms and legs and tentacles.